I did not have to treat the Gospels as inerrant. All I had to start to do was to treat them with the same methods and the same kind of respect and questions as I would treat other historical sources. But for that to be possible for me, they had to be sort of defamiliarized.
And after this history professor did this, she discovered some things that led to her conversion to Christianity. So I'm going to let that video play out, and then I'm going to give my own thoughts about what she's saying on the back end. Let's get into it.
So what were kind of the key realizations that you had that started to make you think that the resurrection was possible and plausible?
The book that was most important for me was N.T. Wright's big book on the resurrection. Although I had to, it is, even for a historian, it's really a slog. So I would constantly have to kind of pause and read a chapter that Tim Keller has in his book Reason for God on the resurrection, where he sort of summarizes N.T. Wright's whole argument so I could remind myself of the forest for the trees. That book is a very elaborate kind of layer after layer exploration of the views of the resurrection and the afterlife, both in the Greco-Roman pagan context in the first century and the spectrum of Jewish views. And he makes clear that whatever Jesus' disciples were hoping would happen, expecting would happen, the end of the gospel story and the resurrection appearances are so far outside the cultural lanes, the sort of range of cultural imaginative options, that one has to really take seriously the possibility that they did not confect these stories to support their beliefs, but rather they developed these beliefs to explain unbelievable things that actually happened. And part of the power of N.T. Wright's book is that, for me, is that it is such a slog, and that there's just this cumulative effect of the depth of detail that he explores that I found really compelling. I guess I had in the past accepted what I now think of as fairly lazy analogies between Jesus and other self-declared messiahs, other stories of God's, descending and rising again to heaven. And once Wright and other scholars subjected these comparisons for me to more scrupulous analysis, I was persuaded that they weren't very good comparisons at all, and that the Jesus case is just incredibly strange. And this drove me into, I think, a new relationship with the Gospels. I was reading the Gospels over and over, and having a reaction. I'm still waiting for the mystical experience that I thought I would get, at some point, and nothing like that. The closest I have gotten to that is the experience of seeing for the first time the sheer strangeness of the things Jesus does, his interactions with people, especially the accounts of healing, and the strange details, the way every healing is a little bit different. Jesus meets each person on their own terms. And as much as I think I had a real sort of allergic reaction to that evangelical theme of, imagine yourself in the scriptures, put yourself in the place of these people. I did start to get tugged into the stories a little bit. There's a way in which, when you spend a lot of time reading primary sources, you develop a sort of sixth sense for what a source is, what category it belongs in. And I think this is one change that's happened in the New Testament scholarship. So, following the famous German scholar Rudolf Bultmann, in the early 20th century, there was, I think, a move toward talking about the Gospels really in the category of mythology. But the consensus has shifted, and I think this is fair to say even of non-believing historians, that the appropriate genre for them is really more Greco-Roman biography. But even then, if you go and you read Plutarch's Parallel Lives, or you read, say, Philostratus's biography of Apollonius of Tyana, who was a traveling Greek sort of magician, healer, who's in the first century was sometimes compared to Jesus. The character of those texts is so different So the character of those texts is they're very polished. They're deeply embroidered. The authors have a real commitment to careful scene setting. There is a brutal roughness to the Gospels, especially Mark. Mark, I'd always kind of dismissed Mark as like the short one and was sort of boring, like least theological. Mark was the one that wrestled me to the ground. And it is the grittiness, the sense that this is not, honestly, it is not a great work of literature. It is a desperate author just trying to get on paper this bananas stuff that this author was much closer to than I had realized. And I became persuaded by the work of people like Richard Bauckham, who's another one of these Anglicans who can kind of speak to secular American snobs, that we need to distinguish between some sort of vague idea of oral tradition passing, from community to community and getting garbled along the way, and oral history, and that there are clues in the text that create not an airtight, but an awfully interesting and persuasive case that the gospel authors were quite close to the events they were describing, and possibly should be dated earlier than I had kind of come to believe. And so all of that, this was so important. I did not have to treat the Gospels as inerrant. All I had to start to do was to treat them with the same methods and the same kind of respect and questions as I would treat other historical sources. But for that to be possible for me, they had to be sort of defamiliarized.
Interesting.
That's a great point.
It's, as a professional historian, what you described is how I feel about the Gospels, because when I bring the techniques that we have in our profession to them, I was telling Molly earlier, it drives me crazy when I just hear somebody casually say, well, there's so many things that don't exactly match across the four Gospels, and so that's why it shows that didn't really happen. And I'm like, okay, so then clearly we don't know that anything in history happened. Because as historians, we know when there's accounts of events, so like I'm a Civil War historian, there is not a single newspaper article and a single eyewitness to the Battle of Gettysburg that agree on the details of what happened at the battle. None of us question the battle, but we have to piece together a rough estimation of what we think happened based on accounts that don't add up. And so to me, and I think as a historian, I came to some things on my own that scholars who are much better than me at the New Testament, come to do as part of their apologetics. But it was just striking to me that, in one gospel, there's two thieves are both making fun of Jesus. In another gospel, one of them eventually turns to him and says, that's what I witnessed. They both have two thieves on either side of Jesus. Different witnesses are remembering different things that they saw. That to me made it read more plausible, and made it read, as you said, more like a true attempt to write a biography than a formalized document. And little things like, the Gospels record that women were first there and that women are the key eyewitnesses in a culture that discounts the testimony of women. As a historian, when I would read a document like that, I would say, okay, now wait a minute. Why are they if they're wanting to convince people of something that isn't true, would they put these witnesses as their first class? Look, these women were the witnesses. So just lots of questions. The way that I methodologically go through and ask questions of a source, if I do the same thing to the Gospels, I've always found them to be very compelling as historical documents.
And the women, their role is one part of the broader, absolute humiliating scandal of the whole end of the Gospels. And this is what N.T. Wright's picture of Jewish theology and culture really drove home to me in a way that I just had not assimilated before. That, no other movement that had believed in a self-declared Messiah had then seen that Messiah killed and declared him God. You would run away, right? Because the whole idea of the role of the Messiah in Jewish thought was that this would be the individual who would lead Israel to worldly victory, and then resurrection would kind of follow for everybody in the context of that victory. And so I think this this helped me see how, I thought as a historian, it had always been really an important part of my self-understanding that I approached people in the past with respect and with a sense of humility. But I think that there was a way in which that first task that we're called to as historians, to just really respect the chasm between them and me, it can easily slide into a kind of condescension, because you forget, in your quest to distance yourself from your subjects, you can dehumanize them a little bit and maybe reduce the complexity of their worldviews. And so worldviews in the first century were, of course, very different from ours, but no less complicated. And so there were clear ideas for these people about what was and was not possible. And they were not fools who would just sort of believe any crazy thing. And certainly they were clear on dead people remaining dead, right? And I think I had just not, I had not fully grappled with the radicalism of the gospel claims in the first century. Forget about now. For me, the big hurdle, and I think this is true of many scholars who spend their careers on this subject, if you don't already allow for the possibility of an open universe, if you are committed to an anti-supernaturalist understanding of reality, then any possible explanation of the empty tomb and Jesus' appearances to his followers is preferable to the Christian explanation, no matter how baroque and elaborate. And I had to come to grips with my own deep anti-supernaturalist bias. I could always sort of thought of myself as open to the claims of Christianity, but I had my whole existence was in this one epistemological groove, in this one kind of lane of approach. And there are good reasons why in the modern research university, in a secular university, certain questions are just ones we set aside and we focus on other questions. But there's a way in which, in doing that, one can just get so used to setting aside those questions that you forget about the presuppositions that are involved in ruling those questions out. And you can begin to think in this subconscious way that those questions are just foolish questions, because your tools that you're allowed to use in your teaching and research are not aimed directly at them. And if you're willing to suspend your disbelief in the supernatural, then you can begin to investigate the historical context of Christians' claims about the empty tomb and the appearances of Christ, that then get you to the point where you're still faced with a leap of faith, but it's no longer a wild leap in the dark. It's a well-researched, reasonable leap. And then you start to realize that you were always making a bit of a leap. You just weren't acknowledged. This was true for me anyway, that I had paid, I think, lip service to the idea that, yes, as a secular agnostic person, I had unprovable presuppositions, because we all do, no view from nowhere, blah, blah, blah. But I'd never truly looked that in the face and wrestled with it.
She kept mentioning that the sheer strangeness of the way that Jesus healed people was one of the big things that really convinced her that he's God. But she didn't really get into specifics here. So to help us really understand what she's talking about, let's look at two important times that Jesus healed people. It's significant to note that out of the 37 miracles we have of Jesus recorded in the Bible, 26 of them were healings. And now Jesus is God. He could make infinite money. He could raise huge skyscrapers. He can do whatever he wants. But he dedicated over 70% of the recorded miracles of his to healings. It's something interesting to note, and it'll be important for later. But the first healing comes from the gospel account of Mark, when Jesus healed a deaf and mute man. It says, there some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven with a deep sigh and said to him, Ephatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, but his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. So he spit and touched this man's tongue. I think that's pretty weird all around. If you did that to me, I'd be pretty grossed out probably. And this is weird even for Jesus, because if we look at the majority of his other healings, never really did he touch people very much. So there's something very strange going on here. So why would Jesus do this? And the answer is because this man was deaf. He could not hear. In none of the other accounts are the people deaf. So if we look here, when Jesus is touching this guy's ears and touching his tongues, it's kind of a crude way of using sign language to meet this man where he's at and to help him understand, hey, I'm about to heal you from all this that you're dealing with. And so Jesus, he's coming down to this man. He came down from heaven to empathize with him and to meet him exactly where he's at. The second healing comes from the Gospel account of John, when Jesus healed a man that was born blind. It says, as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now this one's even weirder for Jesus, because he made muddy saliva and rubbed it on some man's eyes. I mean, we already established that it's kind of weird for him to touch people. And so we asked the question, why did he do this? And now with this one, scholars, they really don't know why he did this. I mean, this man wasn't deaf. We don't really understand the saliva significance. It's kind of guess. Maybe it's like emulating the creative act of God when he first made man, but really we have no idea. And this just goes to show kind of just like the strange nature of God and who he is, that we just can't understand all the ways in he's working. But something big that we can take away here is that Jesus is willing to heal us if we let him. He can relieve us of any childhood trauma, any wounds from family members, hurt from past relationships, any addictions that we have. And Jesus says, come to me, all you who are wearied and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And this is a promise from God. If you cast your burden onto him, he will sustain you if you believe in him. But if you deny him before men, Jesus says that he will deny you before the Father, and you will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so I hope that you will cast your burden onto Jesus and just let this be a reminder to give your problems to him, and he will help you through them and he will sustain you. He's always sustained me. But if you want to watch a video similar to this, I recommend checking out the video on screen right about here. That being said, I love you. God loves you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.